My name is Vivienne Cross. I'm 31 years old and I work as a forensic accountant for the Department of Justice. What that means, in plain terms, is that I follow money. Dirty money. The kind that moves through shell companies and offshore accounts and fake charities until it disappears like smoke and reappears as something clean. I've spent the last 6 years doing work I couldn't talk about at dinner tables. Work that didn't come with a business card or a LinkedIn profile or a single public mention in any press release. Last April, at my sister's engagement party, that silence was used against me like a blade. My sister's name is Courtney. She's 28. She got engaged to a man named Brett in February and decided she wanted a big party to announce it to the family. Rented ballroom, open bar, a photo booth in the corner, the whole thing. I was invited as an afterthought. I know that because I got the text 2 days before, not the paper invitation everyone else received 3 weeks earlier. Still, I showed up. I wore my good dress, the navy one with the structured shoulders. I brought a card with a check inside. I smiled at people I hadn't seen in years. What I didn't know, standing there with a glass of sparkling water, watching the room fill up with people who used to know me, was that my older brother had been talking for months. And that night, in front of 24 relatives and half as many of Brett's family, he decided to say it all out loud. My brother's name is Kevin. He's 35. He works in commercial real estate, does well, drives a car that announces it. He's the kind of man who fills a room with his voice before he fills it with his body. Growing up, he was the one everyone called the responsible one. The one who mowed the lawn without being asked. The one who coached youth soccer on weekends and remembered everyone's birthdays. I was the quiet one. The one who read too much. The one who, as my mother once said at a holiday dinner, lives inside her own head like there's a whole other world in there. She didn't mean it as a compliment. Kevin walked to the front of the room during the toast portion of the evening. He clinked his glass, smiled that practiced smile of his, and said a few warm words about Courtney and Brett. People laughed at the right parts. My aunt wiped her eye. And then, without any shift in tone, without any warning at all, he turned and looked directly at me across the room and said, "I think this is also a good time to address something that's been weighing on our family." I felt the air change. The way it does right before a storm, when the pressure drops and the birds go quiet. "My sister," he said, "has been telling us for 6 years that she works for the government. Federal level. Very important. Very secret." He smiled when he said it, but the smile had teeth. The thing is, none of us can find a single record of it. No government employee database, no agency listing, no anything. And we've looked. He paused, let that land. So I have to ask, in front of everyone who loves this family, is she actually who she says she is? Or has she been lying to us this whole time? The room went still. Courtney looked at her plate. My mother pressed her fingers to her lips. My aunt looked at me with an expression I can only describe as braced, like she'd been waiting for this, like she'd already believed it. I didn't move, didn't flinch, didn't say a single word. Because 6 years in the work I do, you learn one thing above everything else. The person who speaks first in a room like that almost always loses. What happened next is the part that changed everything. And I'll get there. But first I have to tell you how I got to that room in the first place. Because none of what Kevin said that night came out of nowhere. It came out of a family history that started long before either of us understood what we were building. I was 12 when my father left. Not dramatically, not with a fight or a slamming door. He just slowly stopped coming home at the right times and then stopped coming home at all. And by the time I was 13, there were divorce papers on the kitchen table and my mother was crying at odd hours, and Kevin had appointed himself the man of the house in a way that made me feel, at 12 years old, that I had become invisible. Kevin took my father's departure as a personal assignment. He became organized, decisive, loud in the way that people who are afraid of chaos become loud. He needed to control the temperature of every room he walked into, and the easiest way to do that was to set the terms of who mattered and who didn't. In our family, I didn't. Not because I was bad. Not because I was bad. I was a straight-A student. I was in academic decathlon. I qualified for a state math competition in ninth grade and nobody came to watch. When I got into Georgetown on a full scholarship, my mother hugged me for a long time and then said, "Kevin got a full ride to Ohio State too, you know." I know. I was there. I attended his send-off party. I graduated with a degree in accounting and a minor in information systems. I took a position at a mid-level audit firm in DC, hated it for 18 months, and then got a call from a recruiter I'd never heard of. The interview process took 4 months and involved 2 polygraphs, a background check that went back to my kindergarten enrollment records, and a conversation with a man who never told me his last name. I accepted the offer. I signed documents that I cannot describe in full. And I started a job that, for the purposes of every dinner party and family reunion I would attend for the next 6 years, did not exist. I told my family I worked for the Department of Justice in financial compliance. That was true. What I couldn't tell them was what that compliance work actually involved: the ongoing investigations, the international wire fraud cases, the coordination with agencies whose names I wasn't allowed to confirm, the asset seizures, the moments when a number I'd been chasing for 9 months across 4 countries finally led somewhere that mattered. I couldn't tell them any of it, so they filled in the silence themselves. And people, when left to fill silence, almost always fill it with whatever they already secretly believe. Kevin believed I was adrift, that I was performing a career the same way he thought I'd always performed: competence, impressively on the surface, emptily underneath. He'd said things over the years, not accusations, just observations, the kind that sound like concern. "Don't you think it's weird that you can't even tell us the name of your team?" Or, "I was talking to a buddy who works at DOJ and he said he's never heard of your division." Or, "The one that landed hardest at Thanksgiving 3 years ago." I'm not saying you're lying. I'm just saying something doesn't add up, and I love you too much not to say it. I didn't fight him then. I didn't fight him at that party either, because some fights aren't yours to have. Some rooms you have to let fill with doubt and trust that what's real will eventually hold. What I didn't know, standing there in that ballroom while Kevin smiled at the crowd, was that someone had already made a call. I'd worked alongside a woman named Harriet Bloom for 3 years. She was a senior special agent with the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit, one of the most meticulous investigators I had ever encountered, and she had a particular gift for walking into rooms where she was not expected and saying exactly what needed to be said. I'd introduced her to my mother once, briefly at a DOJ public event 2 years prior. I hadn't thought much of it at the time. What I didn't know was that Harriet had been keeping a quiet eye on Kevin, not because of anything he'd done. Kevin hadn't done anything wrong, but because in the course of a separate investigation, an old associate of Kevin's had come up on a flag. Kevin was never a target. He was never charged with anything, but his name had appeared in documents that Harriet's team had reviewed, and she had, professionally and carefully, begun monitoring his behavior, including his behavior toward me. When Kevin finished his little speech, when the room had settled into that particular kind of silence that means everyone is holding their breath, the door at the back of the ballroom opened. Harriet walked in wearing a gray blazer and flat shoes, like she'd come from a work meeting and stopped here on the way home. She was holding a thin folder. She walked calmly to the front of the room, past the floral arrangements and the photo display of Courtney and Brett's relationship timeline, and she stopped about 10 feet from Kevin. She looked at him, then at the room, and said in a voice that was entirely unremarkable in its volume and entirely devastating in its weight, "I'm going to need to borrow your sister for a moment, and I'm going to need you to understand that everything she's told you about her career is not only true, it's protected under federal confidentiality statutes, and what you just did has consequences." Kevin blinked. "Excuse me?" Harriet held up the folder. "I have here a notice from the Office of Professional Responsibility. Mr. Cross, in attempting to access your sister's employment records through a private service which you paid for in March, by the way, you triggered an alert on a protected personnel file. That alert flagged your inquiry to our office. And that inquiry, combined with the public statements you just made, constitutes attempted interference with a federal employee's protected work identity." Someone at the back of the room said, "Oh my God." Kevin looked like the floor had become slightly unreliable. I was asking questions about my sister. You paid a data broker $480 to access federal employment records, Harriet said flatly. That's not a family question, that's a legal one. The room was completely silent. I mean the kind of silent where you can hear the ice shift in the glasses. My mother had both hands folded in her lap and was looking at the centerpiece like it contained answers. Courtney had gone the color of the white tablecloths. I stood up slowly. I watched to where Harriet was standing, not rushing, not performing anything. And I looked at Kevin. He looked back at me and I could see it. Not guilt exactly, but the specific expression of a man who has just realized the architecture of his certainty was built on sand. I don't want to do this here, I said to him quietly, and I'm not going to. I turned to the room, to my family, to Brett's family, to the people who had just watched my brother try to dismantle me in front of an open bar in a photo booth. I love my sister, I said. That's the only reason I'm here tonight. That's the only reason I came. I looked at Courtney. She was crying. She nodded at me. Just once. A small, helpless nod. I walked out with Harriet. Outside, the night was cold. There was a parking lot, and a Marriott sign, and the distant sound of a highway. Not exactly cinematic. But Harriet handed me her jacket because my good navy dress had no sleeves, and we sat on a low concrete wall near the entrance, and she said, "You okay?" "I've been better," I said. "I've been a lot worse." She nodded. We sat in silence for a moment. "How long have you known about Kevin?" I asked. "6 months?" "And you waited?" "I waited until he did something actionable," she said. "I'm not in the business of preemptive intervention. Neither are you." That was true. I'd built my entire career on patience, on following the evidence where it actually led rather than where I wanted it to go. Kevin had been the opposite. He'd decided what he believed and then gone looking for proof. That's how you end up paying $480 to a data broker and accidentally triggering a federal alert on your own sister's file. The weeks after the party were complicated in the way that family things always are when the surface finally cracks and whatever's underneath comes flooding out. My mother called me the following Tuesday. She didn't apologize exactly. She said, "I didn't know what Kevin was planning." I believed her. She paused for a long time and then said, "I should have asked more questions. About your work. About why I was letting your brother speak for the whole family." That was as close to an apology as she'd ever managed about anything, and I chose to accept it. Courtney texted me the night after the party, 3 texts in a row at 11 p.m. The first said, "I'm so sorry." The second said, "I didn't know." The third said, "I should have sent you the real invitation." That last one made me laugh in my dark apartment, genuinely laugh, which I hadn't done in a few days. I texted back, "We're okay. Don't let him ruin your engagement." She sent back a heart emoji, and then, a minute later, "He's not invited to the wedding." Kevin. Kevin was a harder problem. Harriet's office sent him a formal notice. He wasn't charged with anything. The inquiry into his associate had already closed, and his own involvement had never risen to anything prosecutable. But the notice made clear that accessing protected federal records through a third-party broker, even for personal reasons, violated federal statute, and that any further attempts would result in criminal referral. Kevin hired a lawyer who told him the same thing Harriet had already told him for free. He called me once, about 3 weeks later. I almost didn't pick up. I did, because I've learned over the years that the calls you avoid have a way of growing heavier the longer you leave them. "I was wrong," he said, right away like he'd rehearsed it. Maybe he had. "About the way I handled it, at the party." "Okay," I said. "I still have questions," he said. "About your life. About what you actually do." "I know," I said, "and you're not going to answer them." "No." A long pause. "That's hard for me, Viv." "I know it is. It's hard for me, too." I meant it. There's nothing simple about carrying a life that the people you grew up with can't see. You learn to live in the gap between who you are and who they're allowed to know. You stop waiting for them to understand and start hoping instead that they'll decide to trust you anyway. Kevin had decided not to trust. He decided to dig instead, and what he found wasn't what he expected. "I'm not your enemy," I said. "I've never been." He didn't say anything for a moment. Then, "I know. I think I knew that. He stopped. Started again. "Growing up after Dad left, I thought I understood everyone in the family. I thought I had a handle on it, and you were always the one I couldn't read. That's not the same as something being wrong." "No," he said. "It's not." That was the end of the conversation that mattered. We said goodbye, and I sat with my phone in my hand for a while in my apartment that is very little furniture and a lot of books, listening to the city outside. 6 years. 6 years of work that I couldn't explain to the people who raised me. 6 years of going home for Christmas and deflecting questions about my caseload, nodding vaguely when asked if I liked my colleagues. Listening to my mother say things like, "Vivienne could have been a doctor, you know," to whoever happened to be standing nearby. 6 years of being misread and accepting it because the alternative was the kind of transparency that could get someone killed. I want to be honest about what that costs. Not for sympathy. I chose this, freely, every step of the way, but because I think people imagine that kind of secrecy is glamorous. It isn't. It's lonely. It's a specific kind of lonely where you're surrounded by people who care about you and still feel like you're observing them through glass. You get very good at attending things. Dinners, parties, holiday gatherings. You smile at the right moments. You ask the right questions. And at the end of the night, you go home alone and decompress in whatever way works for you. Which for me involves a very long walk and occasionally a glass of bourbon and a book I've already read before. Harriet once asked me, early on in our partnership, if I ever wanted to quit. Just walk away? Take a job at a regular firm? Have a regular job title I could put on a regular LinkedIn profile? "Sometimes," I told her honestly. "What stops you?" she asked. I thought about it. "The work matters," I said, "and I'm good at it, and those two things don't always line up, and when they do, you don't walk away." She nodded. She understood. She'd been doing it for 20 years. There's a case I can't discuss by name or by specific detail, but I can tell you that during my 4th year, I spent 11 months tracking a single financial thread across 3 countries. It started with an anomaly in a nonprofit's 990 filing, a reporting document that most people file and forget, a form so unremarkable that it's used as a metaphor for paperwork nobody reads. But I read it. I read every line. And in the gap between line 17 and line 22, in a discrepancy of roughly $60,000 that had been handled with just enough care to seem accidental, I found the beginning of something much larger. That thread led to a network. That network led to a seizure. And that seizure stopped the movement of a very specific kind of cargo across a very specific border at a very specific time. I will never be able to say more than that. I will never be quoted in a press release or mentioned in a court filing or thanked publicly by anyone who knows what I actually did. That's not complaint. That's just the work. But it matters to me, even when I'm sitting in my mother's kitchen on Christmas morning and she's going on about how Kevin just got promoted. And isn't that something? The work matters to me. It sits in my chest like ballast. It keeps me level. I went back to see Harriet about 2 months after the engagement party, not for anything professional, just to have coffee. We met at a place near the office that she's been going to for a decade, a corner spot with uncomfortable chairs and excellent espresso. I asked her why she'd come that night. "Because you would have stood there and taken it," she said, "and you would have been fine, but you didn't have to be." "That wasn't your call to make," I said. "No," she agreed. "It wasn't. I made it anyway." "Are you mad?" I thought about it. "No," I said. "I'm not." She nodded, drank her coffee. "You're good at your job, Viv, but you are terrible at accepting help." "That's fair. It's a hazard of the work," she said. "You spend enough time being the only one who knows what's really happening in a room, you stop thinking anyone else can be useful." That stayed with me. It still stays with me. I've been thinking lately about what it means to be misread by the people who should know you best. Kevin wasn't wrong that something didn't add up. He just drew the wrong conclusion from the math. He saw absence and called it dishonesty, saw silence and called it guilt, saw a life that couldn't be verified through ordinary channels and decided that meant it wasn't real. It was real. It was more real than most of what you could find through any search engine or any data broker or any government database that a civilian is allowed to access. I think about the women in my cohort, the ones who chose this kind of work, the ones who go home to families that don't fully understand them, who attend weddings and baby showers and sibling engagement parties and deflect questions about their jobs with practiced vagueness, who carry years of work that nobody will ever be allowed to know about. We're not special because of this secrecy. The secrecy is just the tax we pay for doing something that matters in a way that requires it, what I've learned. What I'm still learning is that you can't control how people interpret your silence. You can only choose whether that interpretation breaks you. Kevin chose to turn my silence into a public accusation. I chose to stand still and wait. And what arrived, in the form of a woman in a gray blazer with a thin folder and flat shoes, was the truth defending itself. I didn't plan that. I didn't arrange it. It happened because it was real, and real things eventually hold. Courtney's wedding is in September. I'm her maid of honor. She picked a pale gold dress for me, which is objectively not my color, and I told her so, and she laughed and said, "Deal with it," in the way that only little sisters can say to older ones, and I felt something settle in my chest that had been unsettled for a long time. Kevin will be there. We've had 3 phone calls since the party, none of them easy, all of them real. He's not the villain of the story, even though he played one for a night in a rented ballroom in front of 24 people and an open bar. He's a man who was afraid of something he couldn't understand and handled that fear badly. I've done the same, in different rooms in different ways. We don't get to be the heroes of every chapter we're in. What I know is this: I wore that navy dress to my sister's party for her sake, not for mine. I stood still while my brother spoke because standing still was what the moment required. And when the truth arrived in the form of someone who knew me well enough to show up without being asked, I walked out with my head level and my hands steady. I've spent 6 years being invisible by design. I've gotten good at it. But invisible isn't the same as gone, and silence isn't the same as having nothing to say. I have plenty to say. I just choose my moments. Last week, I started teaching a quarterly seminar for new DOJ financial analysts. 3 hours. Thursday mornings, a room with bad fluorescent lighting and a whiteboard that has never fully erased anything. I don't tell them what cases I've worked. I don't tell them anything classified. What I tell them is this: the most important skill you will develop in this work is not speed, and it's not pattern recognition, and it's not technical fluency with whatever software we're using this year. It's patience, the capacity to sit with something unresolved and not force it into a shape that makes you comfortable before it's ready. One of them asked me last week how I handle it when the people in my life don't understand what I do. I thought about Kevin in that ballroom. I thought about Harriet's gray blazer. I thought about Courtney's 3 texts at 11 p.m. and my mother's almost apology on a Tuesday afternoon, and my father's absence, and the way I learned very young to be the kind of person who reads the room before speaking into it. You stop needing them to understand, I said, and you start trusting what you know about yourself. That's not indifference, that's armor, and the difference matters. The analyst nodded. She was 24, sharp-eyed, serious. She reminded me of no one and also of myself entirely. "Does it get easier?" she asked. I picked up the dry erase marker. "Some parts," I said. "The part where you stop explaining yourself, that gets much easier. The part where you stop wishing they already knew." I paused. "That one takes longer." I wrote the day's first case study on the board. She opened her notebook. The fluorescent light buzzed. Outside the city carried on its business, the ordinary, accountable, publicly verifiable business of people who can explain themselves at dinner parties. I've made my peace with not being one of them. Wherever you're listening from tonight, Whether you're driving home late from a job that drains you, or sitting in a house full of people who mean well but can't quite see you, or lying awake wondering if the quieter choices you've made in your life were actually the right ones, I want you to know something. Being misunderstood by the people who love you is one of the loneliest feelings in the world. But it is not evidence that you were wrong. Some lies don't come with easy explanations. Some work doesn't come with visible proof. Some people will decide what to believe about you before you've had a chance to finish the sentence. Stand anyway. Stay still. Let the truth carry its own weight. It does, eventually. It always does. If this story found you at the right moment, we'd love to know. Drop a comment and tell us where you're watching from. We read every single one. And if it moved you even a little, consider subscribing to Revenge Broken. We're here every week telling the stories that don't always get told. Thank you for spending your time with us tonight. I've thought a lot about what Kevin actually did that night. Not the speech, not the data broker, not the $480 he spent trying to prove something he'd already decided was true. I mean the thing underneath all of that, the decision to treat my silence as evidence of guilt. That's the part that stayed with me long after the party ended and Courtney stopped crying and the rented ballroom went dark. There's a kind of thinking that looks like concern but is really just control. Kevin told himself he was protecting the family. Maybe he even believed it, but what he was actually doing was refusing to tolerate something he couldn't measure. And when people can't measure something, they tend to destroy it rather than sit with the discomfort of not understanding it. That's not a Kevin problem. That's a human problem. That's a human problem. I've done versions of it myself, in smaller rooms with lower stakes. Decided I already knew what a piece of evidence meant before I'd finished reading it. Closed a line of inquiry because the answer was taking too long. The difference between that impulse and good judgment is patience, the willingness to stay with something unresolved until it resolves itself honestly. I built my career on that distinction. It took me longer to apply it to my own family. What I know now, in a way I didn't fully understand before that night, is that the people who misread you aren't always wrong about the facts. Kevin was right that my records were hard to find. He was right that I was vague. He was right that something didn't line up with what he expected a normal career to look like. What he got wrong was the conclusion, and he got it wrong because he stopped asking questions and started delivering verdicts. That's the moment trust breaks, not when someone doesn't understand you, but when they decide they no longer need to. Harriet showed up because the truth was real, and real things leave traces, even when they're hidden. What Kevin tried to bury me with, the secrecy, the absence of a verifiable record, was the same architecture that protects the work I do. He picked up a weapon he didn't understand, and it turned in his hand. That's not luck, that's consequence. Actions accumulate quietly and then arrive all at once, and the only variable is whether you've been living in a way that can hold up when they do. I think about Vivienne at 24, sitting across from a recruiter she'd never heard of, deciding to say yes to a life she couldn't explain. That decision cost her things she didn't fully anticipate. Dinners where she said nothing real, holidays where she smiled through the wrong questions, a brother who turned her privacy into a public accusation. And it also built something that held. 6 years of work that mattered, a colleague who showed up without being asked, a sister who sent 3 texts at 11 p.m. and meant every word. The cost and the holding. They came from the same choice. That's how it works. You don't get to separate them. What I tell anyone carrying a life that the people around them can't fully see is this. You are not obligated to make yourself legible to everyone who loves you. Love and understanding are not the same thing, and demanding that they be is a kind of cruelty dressed up as closeness. What you owe the people in your life is honesty about what you can give, and a willingness to stay in the relationship even when what you can give is incomplete. Kevin and I are still figuring that out. It's slow, it's imperfect. Some weeks it looks like a 10-minute phone call that ends without resolution. Some weeks it looks like nothing at all, but we're still in it, which is more than I expected, standing in that parking lot in my sleeveless navy dress while Harriet handed me her jacket and the highway hummed in the distance. That's enough for now. That's what I've got. And most of the time, I've learned, enough is exactly that.